Welcome to a reading of my book, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 1, Section 4. The Mysteriousness of Consciousness, Demystified. Consciousness is mysterious, yet we speak here of its mysteriousness, which we hope to illuminate, rather than its mystery, which implies inexplicability. This section was also provided introduction to its siblings, mysticism and religion, which also offer mythological and metaphorical inroads into consciousness. In addition to error theory, I have mentioned a number of reasons why consciousness is difficult to apprehend, which might attract an air of mysteriousness. Explanations of the mysterious can be produced by a simple disregard of what cannot be seen, resulting from an overemphasis on the material world and technology, created by an absence of appropriate categories of thought, language and methodology. I have begun to explain how graduated levels of consciousness produces a mental occlusion or error theory that might be included as reasons for this mysteriousness. The structures of divisibility and insularity can also be added below in showing how personal identity can be divided and how insularity generates a form of singular or attenuated reference that is a basis of the experience of mysteriousness. The mysteriousness of consciousness arises not just out of our lack of understanding, our inability to explain it, or how it came into existence, or even more difficultly, how we account for phenomenal experience, dubbed by David Chalmers as the hard problem. But mysteriousness also arises out of less tangible factors. It arises out of questions about how consciousness cannot be readily located in space, about its relations with time and physicality, and how, rather than why, it exists at all. More tellingly, the mysteriousness of consciousness is allied to a sense of the uncanny, or the sheer strangeness of finding oneself to be a self-conscious being, and how consciousness can recognize itself and claim a personal identity. These and the ubiquitous presence of consciousness in human life go some way towards presenting what Stanley Cavell called the uncanniness of the ordinary, which Jennifer Church connects to its emotional counterpart in ambivalence, providing us with another descriptive feature of both consciousness and value that we can employ in this work. Observations such as these have led some theorists to the view that we will always lack the kind of oblique perspectives required to understand consciousness. This pessimism isn't accepted here. I even employ this lack of perspective and resulting opacity as a tool of inquiry. We find, for example, that an analysis of religion helps us to articulate and domesticate the mysteriousness of life. It disinters hidden primary values and paradoxically provides a paradigm example of a system of exemplified error, wherein consciousness becomes conspicuous by its absence. As we will see, religion is subject to the illuminating error of projection in understanding consciousness in terms of objects outside the mind. Yet all of the three classical approaches to human understanding of religion, psychology and philosophy can figure in this kind of cryptic analysis. Psychology is explicitly dedicated to examining the phenomenon of mind, but it is also frequently engaged in neurological or behavioristic accounts of the brain or behavior, in which mind becomes a kind of black box of correlating inputs and outputs rather than a phenomenon to be investigated. Even philosophy has a contradictory record and often covers itself with evasion and denial in the form of materialistic theories of mind and disinterest in the big questions of life and death. Yet these failings are both clues into the kind of problem at hand and a reason to reconsider how an investigation of human life as consciousness could be conducted. Similarly, the question of personal identity is a standard philosophical issue, but it's also another source of mysteriousness that provides another avenue into understanding the phenomenon of consciousness. The identity of any object, however, whether material or conscious, is tantalizing. What is it that determines the different identities of two anatomically or atomically identical objects? Is it their location in space and time? Is it just a matter of linguistic designation? Or is it a function of the observing consciousness? A common metaphor used in analysis of the identity of material objects is of a boat or car or motorcycle, depending upon our interest. In this account, over a period of time, the vehicle is repaired with new parts until none of its old parts remain. Is it still the original vehicle? In another version, all the old parts are put back together, which then is the original vehicle. These questions are interesting, but not irresolvably paradoxical. A bit of redefinition and philosophical apologetics can fix them up. The question of personal identity is both more mysterious and more revealing. Questions about my presence here and now, rather than being someone else at a different time, can evoke either platitudes or a sense of strangeness and the uncanny, depending upon our inclination and perspective. Widespread misunderstanding of personal identity can be seen in beliefs such as that the advent of human cloning will threaten human uniqueness or provide personal immortality. Yet even given the possibility of identical molecular structures and social experiences of individual clones, the unique conscious identities of such individuals will be separate and different. A similar lack of appreciation of personal identity can also be seen at the supposedly highest levels of care and concern in loving human relations. It is not uncommon, for instance, for so-called love to be entirely dependent upon attractions of physique and personality rather than in the belief and value of another self-conscious individual. In many of these cases, the lover would be happy with a replacement clone of his beloved, minus certain undesirable traits. Many of us, however, take ourselves to be individuals with unique, continuous and indivisible identities, because we have a unity of experience as reflective beings that is gathered together around an executive self-consciousness through a continuity of time and place, and we appreciate our loved ones in the same way. Falling in love with someone we don't know might be justified with this view that the other is a self-conscious entity who can never be known as such. The crucial factor here in determining personal identity, however, is the identification of a unique self-consciousness. We believe that this identity is not interchangeable with that of others without radical revision, and that replacement of physical parts of ourselves, as happening in modern medicine, would not impugn that identity. Yet all this is open to qualification. In contradiction to Descartes and a traditional belief in the transparency and unity of mind, we already have reason to think that human identity and consciousness is literally as well as psychologically subject to diminution, division and fragmentation. I will have more to say about how divisibility disrupts the fundamental unity of consciousness with some help from Sartre, split experiments and other considerations. Unexpected consequences of divisibility for personal identity, I found popular expression in a Star Trek story employed by Derek Parfit in another setting. The first mate of the starship Enterprise, Will Riker, is teleported to the surface of a planet. But something goes wrong. Not only are Riker's atoms and molecules reduced to patterns of energy which are reconstituted in a new location, but they are also unknowingly duplicated. Some years later, the new Riker meets the old Riker. The intervening years have created some personality differences, but there is no way of telling who is the original and who is replicated. Both have unimpeachable claims to the memories, history and identity of the former Riker. But now there are two unique self-conscious individuals. This piece of modern mythology illustrates a legitimate hypothetical consideration of a possibility which forces reflection on the meaning of self-conscious identity, raises questions about the view that identity is determined by memory, and challenges traditional notions about the indivisibility and singular identity of human consciousness. Similar implications of discontinuities in personal identity have been described more elegantly by Bernard Williams and more extensively by Robert Nozick. Barry Dainton distinguishes between the identities of the psychological self and the phenomenal self, and suggests that teleportation would instead be an inconspicuous means of committing suicide. Discontinuities in personal identity have also captured our imagination in the popular media, in, for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger's film Total Recall, and in the television series Resurrection. Yet science fiction can be replaced with a religious version of the story, where people die and are raised again by God on Judgment Day. One question here is whether the person being judged is the same person who lived before, or another conscious being with duplicate beliefs, memories and body. Given the above considerations on personal identity, what would constitute the same person is in question, even if given a duplicate body created by God. The view that it must be the same person fails to appreciate both the special and irreplaceable uniqueness of a conscious individual and the character of consciousness. Moreover, if God can recreate one individual, he can recreate two or more identical individuals. And if two identities, A and B, can be produced from one, how can I say that I am A and not B? Or I may even be neither A or B, but C, and A and B could have been disposed of altogether. These possibilities evoke mysteriousness, because something with which we take to have familiarity, our personal identity, is shown to be quite alien due to the unusual level at which the identification of personal identity is made. Saul Kripke makes use of such an identification of personal identity in his argument against materialism that we will discuss later. The issue of personal identity can also illuminate the mysteriousness of consciousness by examining how that identity is established, whether by name, through complex processes of identification, or by means of self-consciousness. Dainton examines discontinuities of personal identity as a means of illuminating the mysteriousness of consciousness by making the distinction between the psychological self and the much misunderstood phenomenal self, which overlaps psychological capacities but can be distinguished from them. That is, psychological properties such as memories can be transferred without a corresponding continuity of phenomenal identity. The mysteriousness of consciousness can be further elucidated by comparison with other mysterious phenomena that share the same patterns of experience. Freud, Russell and Wittgenstein have, for instance, described mysticism as having a sense of oneness with the universe, of interrelatedness, of inexpressibility, and feeling the world as a limited whole, respectively. We can, however, say more about these descriptions to understand experiences such as mysticism as well as the mysterious as a certain kind of perception which is produced by attenuated references within a limited background of understanding. This isn't the same as saying that things are mysterious simply because we don't understand them. It's implied by Wittgenstein when he says that there are things that cannot be put into words, they are what is mystical. On our interpretation, they are mystical because they cannot easily be described, conceptualized or perceived, rather than being the mystery that cannot be described. That is, the mysteriousness of certain notions or objects such as God, being, the universe, flying saucers, and the experience of self-consciousness is explicable in terms of their lack of reference to other objects of the same genus, to explanatory concepts, and to contexts of understanding, because they imply conceptions of totality which lack reference almost by definition, or simply because so little is known about them. This account of mysteriousness as attenuated reference becomes clearer when compared to the now common notion of perception, which does involve reference to explanatory concepts and backgrounds of understanding. One version of this now standard view of perception was incorporated into structural linguistics in the early 20th century by Ferdinand de Saussure, who proposed that meaning is created by the relations, differences and contrast between words and ideas rather than their inherent content. Jacques Derrida held that meaning is produced by the difference between the terms employed. In Wittgenstein's complex or cluster theory of meaning and language, this relation between objects and other concepts or contexts takes the form of multiple and myriad references to account for the formation of meaning and language in the world. This involves a network of numerous and complex interrelations which constitutes a fabric of meaning with overlapping and interlocking references, providing the required semantic context and epistemological background. An opposing view, typically found in the atomism of Bertrand Russell, has become anachronistic. Another application of sense without reference, in the case of some mathematical entities and fictional characters discussed by Gottlob Frege, Saul Kripke, and what Gareth Evans refers to as empty singular terms, do not entirely escape an air of mysteriousness. On a standard conception of meaning and perception, a reference to something other than a perceived object is a necessary condition of its perception. Otherwise, the perception or perspective in which that object figures would take on the character of an undifferentiated monotone, such as a red spot on a red wall, which is epistemologically equivalent to no spot at all. Epistemic or semantic reference between a perceived object and some other datum distinct from the object is required because the intelligibility of an object requires a contrasting perception of what it is not as a context or background of understanding. This requirement has been widely employed by many, including Hegel, when he insists that the intelligibility of being requires a reference to non-being. The point made here, however, is that exceptions to, or attenuations of, the standard perception of multiple reference occur in such notions of being, God, and the experience of self-consciousness, and it is this attenuated reference which produces and partly explains mysteriousness. On the generally accepted standard view of epistemic meaning, however, self-consciousness could not exist in the absence of ulterior reference, because it cannot be conscious of other self-conscious beings in the same way that it is conscious of itself. That is, it suffers epistemic as well as ontological insularity. But because self-consciousness does exist, we need a further non-referential account of meaning with which to explain it. This helps to account for, but not exhaust, the explanations of the mysteriousness of life and consciousness when we feel a sense of the uncanny or strangeness at finding ourselves located in a particular time and place, or simply finding ourselves existing at all. Does this mean that we are approaching the demise of awe, wonder, and mystery? In one sense, yes, but it also means whether we are nearing the beginning of our inquiry, both existentially and intellectually. As an introduction to the descriptive capacities of religion and mysticism, mysteriousness is presented here as an instrument of revelation as well as obfuscation. The discovery of mysteriousness in our personal and intellectual lives signals a more profound encounter with consciousness than that of an intellectual interest in mental states. It also stimulates different kinds of questions. How should we respond to this experience? What can we do with the phenomenon of consciousness? What are the limits and possibility? What can we make of other conscious beings? And how can we deal with the prospect of personal oblivion? These are diverse questions, yet they are related. They aren't questions of science about gravity or causality, or even of psychology, about mental health or neurology. They are questions of a human existence best set within the context of consciousness. Others, like Wittgenstein, see them as meaningless riddles to be dissolved rather than resolved, thereby letting the fly out of the fly bottle. Either way, they need to be either dissolved or resolved. In this project, philosophy is the natural facilitator, with unexpected help from both religion and science, yet initial intuitions require us to first take a hard look at mind or consciousness. The next section 4 is entitled Intimations of a Structural Conception of Mind.